kings who ever lived. Well, Solomon had apostatized. He had loved too many foreign women and built shrines for the idols. And as a result, the Lord wasn't so happy with him anymore. The Lord told him that because you have done this, because you have forsaken me and served other gods and did exactly the opposite of that thing I told you to do, I am going to tear the kingdom away from you. The Lord gave him two caveats. He said, I am not going to do it in your lifetime. In other words, it will happen in the days of your son. And I am not going to take all of it away. I'm only going to take 10 tribes away and give it to somebody else. And the reason for these caveats, anybody remember why the Lord made those caveats, not now and not all? Yes. Because of the promise to David. Do you remember? There was actually a second reason that we talked about too. Does anybody remember what that was? That one was a little more under the radar than some of the others, but it was for the sake of David my servant and for what? For the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen. The Lord had chosen Jerusalem as the city where He would put His name. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, the Lord told the people they weren't supposed to worship just anywhere, but they were supposed to worship at the place where the Lord God chooses, which in this case would be, in the context of kings, Jerusalem. It was where the temple was built, and it was where His name would dwell. As a result of that, the Lord considers Jerusalem His special chosen city and David His special chosen king. Even if Solomon is unfaithful, the Lord will still be faithful to His promises. Now what happens throughout the rest of chapter 11 is the Lord raises up a series of adversaries for Solomon. First He raises up Hadad the Edomite and Rezon the Aramean, who becomes king in Damascus. And then thirdly, and most importantly for our purposes, we have Jeroboam the son of Nebat, or Nebat, or however you want to pronounce it. Jeroboam was a little different from the others in that he was actually within Solomon's administration. He was an Ephraimite who was in charge of certain forced labor in the construction of the Millo. And Jeroboam was confronted by the prophet Ahijah. Ahijah took his garment and tore it into 12 pieces and gave 10 of the pieces to Jeroboam and said that the Lord is going to give you 10 tribes of Solomon's kingdom. And He's going to give leave one tribe for Solomon. And you all might be wondering, well, doesn't Ahijah know how to do math? That 10 plus 1 does not equal 12? And, what we find out later is that Benjamin was also included in the tribes that Rehoboam got to keep. I don't know why they divided it up. 10 and 11 equals, 10 and 1 equals 12, but that's what we have here. Jenna, do you have something?
I thought they said they didn't.
Yeah, they didn't make slaves of the Israelites, they just made slaves of them. It's kind of confusing the way that's worded. In chapter 10, is it chapter 10? No, it's chapter 9, excuse me. All the chapters run together in my head. In chapter 9, in verse 22, it says, Solomon did not make slaves of the sons of Israel, for they were men of war, his servants, his princes, his captains, his chariot commanders, and his horsemen. But the problem with that verse is that the way it is translated is, it kind of glosses over the fact that the word for slave in the first part of the verse is exactly the same as the word for servant in the second part of the verse. So Solomon did not make slaves of the sons of Israel because they were men of war, his slaves, his princes, his captains, his chariot commanders, and his horsemen. Now that's kind of strange sounding. It goes on to describe how the Canaanites were actually put to forced labor as well. And we get indications in chapter 12 that Solomon had been exacting forced labor from the people too. I don't really know what to do with that statement at the beginning of verse 22, other than to note, well, that it's there. And we have to remember sometimes the story of Solomon is kind of told to us with a little bit of a wink. Solomon did this thing, and there's not really a commentary on it from the Lord until you get to chapter 11 and you find out, oh right, God wasn't pleased with him building idols. I don't know. That doesn't really answer your question, but thank you for making it difficult. Well, that's why I married you, I guess. All right.
That's my priority.
All right. Yes. All right. Moving on. Well, Anyhow, what happens is that the Lord makes a promise to Jeroboam. If, it will be, verse 38, that if you listen to all that I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my sight by observing my statutes and my commandments as my servant David did, then I will be with you and build you an enduring house as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. We talk about the promise to Abraham. We talk about the promise to David. Did you know that there's a promise to Jeroboam? There is. But why don't we ever talk about the promise to Jeroboam? Anybody know?
Jeroboam didn't keep his end of the deal from day one, so God did.
Jeroboam doesn't keep his end of the deal. This is the great story of regret right here, because Jeroboam has a real opportunity on his hands. We could be talking about the promise to Jeroboam thousands of years later, but we're not. Because Jeroboam does something quite different than David does. Jeroboam is not faithful to the Lord. And so Jeroboam does not become the David of the north. Instead, he becomes the anti-David, the anti-anointed one. Dare I throw in the phrase anti-Christ in that mix as well. The Jeroboam becomes someone who is everything that David is not. He is the negative standard for Israel. We're going to see that later as we get into chapter 12. Mark.
Oh, it just occurred to me, there's a lot of people that think, if God would just speak to people today, they would change. Wait a minute. The rich man said to Abraham, Father Abraham, send somebody back from the dead to my brothers so they'll listen. Abraham said they don't listen to Moses and the prophets. They won't listen if somebody comes back from the dead. Here's God speaking directly to Jeroboam, and Jeroboam didn't listen to what he said.
Jeroboam, that's a good point to bring out. Jeroboam had a prophet speak directly to him. Wouldn't that be kind of cool if we had that benefit at our disposal? But the problem was that even though Jeroboam had a prophet speak to him, Jeroboam didn't stay faithful. But more on that when we get to chapter 12. Anyhow, because of Jeroboam's revolt, and we don't know precisely the nature of that revolt, there's a Septuagint variant actually that maybe mentions it in a little more detail and describes how Jeroboam himself tried to aspire to the throne. But the end result of that in verse 40 is Solomon wanted to kill Jeroboam, and Jeroboam winds up fleeing to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt. He was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. There's another Septuagint variant, and again, this isn't in our English Bibles because our English Bibles haven't looked at the Septuagint, but that talks about Jeroboam actually getting a wife from Shishak's children as well in Egypt. So the Greek version of Kings tells you the name of Jeroboam's wife. Yes, Jen, you have something?
Other guy that Solomon was married?
That's a good question. I haven't done the research on my pharaohs to answer that question. Shishak is one of the few pharaohs in the Bible that we're actually told the name of. Most pharaohs in the Bible are just called Pharaoh, which is clearly a title for the kings of Egypt. But there's a couple of pharaohs that we know the names of. Pharaoh Necho, later on in 2 Kings, and Pharaoh Shishak, who will be identified with the historical Shoshenq. He ruled in the mid-900s, during the 10th century BC. Yes, Jen? Well, it might have been a different pharaoh. Yeah. Yeah, it might have been a different pharaoh involved in that. That's the thing. This chapter is not being told in close chronological order. It's possible that the Hey Dad is talking to a completely different pharaoh in the middle of chapter 11, if that's what you're thinking of. Or that Solomon married the daughter of a completely different pharaoh. But we don't know. That's just it. Like I said, I don't know my pharaoh chronology well enough to answer the question. But I have to look that up. Anyhow, Solomon tries to kill Jeroboam. Jeroboam flees to Egypt. Kind of reminds us of how when Pharaoh tried to kill Moses back in Exodus chapter 2, and Moses fled to Egypt, fled from Egypt rather, and the death of the ruler seeking his life prompts him to return to the land from which he fled. Which brings us to verses 41 through 43, Solomon's death. The rest of the acts of Solomon, and whatever he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? Thus the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of his father David. He and his son Rehoboam reigned in his place. So Solomon seeks Jeroboam's death, but the next thing we learn about in the text is that he meets his own death. All of his other deeds are recorded in a work called, literally, the Words of Solomon, or the Acts of Solomon. And do we have this book called the Acts of Solomon? No, we don't. That's an example of a book that is lost to us. Solomon is the only king in the book of Kings to rule all Israel in verse 42. He did it for 40 years. He dies and he leaves his son Rehoboam as the next king. Now, I guess some comments on Solomon's reign before we move on. Solomon is, in the book of Chronicles, which is running parallel to the book of Kings, portrays Solomon's reign a little differently. It talks about Solomon's rise to power, his demonstrations of secular wisdom and administrative justice, his palace, his wives, his idolatry, his adversaries. Chronicles, sorry, I said that backwards. Chronicles does not contain those things. Chronicles does not contain the narrative of Solomon's rise to power in chapters 1 and 2. It does not contain some of the administrative details. It does not contain the account of the construction of his palace, and it does not contain his wives' apostasy or adversaries. The only wife that Chronicles ever mentions is the daughter of Pharaoh. And you could read Chronicles and walk away and you might conclude he was monogamous if you didn't have kings. But that's clearly not the case. Chronicles doesn't give us an evaluative statement either. Chronicles doesn't have that phrase, oh, Solomon did good in the sight of the Lord, or Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord. They don't say those things. It just kind of tells you what happened. Well, the book of Kings doesn't do that. The book of Kings tells you in chapter 11 and verse 6 that Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not follow the Lord fully as David his father had done. Now, why does Chronicles not tell you this part? Anybody? Well, I guess this would require us to read Chronicles and kind of form an opinion about that. But
the purpose of the book was a little bit different.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, there's a different purpose.
No different things.
Chronicles has a tendency to kind of whitewash both David and Solomon. And for instance, we're not told anything about David's adultery with Bathsheba, the big sin that he commits in 2 Samuel 11. And in fact, Chronicles tends to omit any material that suggests that David or Solomon had rivals for the throne, which is why Chronicles never mentions Ishbosheth, Absalom, Adonijah, Sheba, or any of these adversaries, and doesn't even really mention Mephibosheth. Now, that doesn't mean that the chronicler was ignorant of that. He knew what was going on. He obviously had the book of Kings in front of him. But he writes with a different purpose. A purpose to portray an idealistic history. An ideal kingdom where David and Solomon rule the ideal kingdom as ideal rulers. And maybe it was designed to give people something to shoot for. And of course to foreshadow the ideal king that we know as well in Jesus. Now there's more we could say about Solomon's reign. There's speculation, for instance, some people wonder if he repented from his apostasy. We just flat out don't know the answer to that. I think that that's a wishful thinking and you'd love to believe it, but I can't prove it one way or the other. So that's where we're at anyway. But before we get into chapter 12, are there any comments or questions on the text?
Years.
Oh.
I can tell you that. I probably skimmed something, but what I do for a living, we have to keep things trace the happenings of something.
Right.
And who was involved. Not necessarily all the like the king, but have a pattern of on.
Yeah.
So, not having read Chronicles, I don't know.
Chronicles is interesting. There's a lot of names, a lot of genealogies, a lot of administrative type details in that book. It's still a good book to read because it's the Word of God, and so therefore we ought to read it and understand it. It's. I highly. I mean, you know what? It's. I highly recommend it.
It's
Yeah.
like falling asleep during Leviticus.
Oh yes, yes. Okay, well, maybe some someday, Lord willing, we will have a class on Chronicles, if the Lord permits me enough time to do that. And then we will get into those things as well. Anyhow, 1 Kings chapter 12, let's talk about Rehoboam, Solomon's successor. Now, the Lord told Solomon the kingdom was going to divide, but we haven't learned anything about that up to this point. So we'll go ahead and start. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. When Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of it, he was living in Egypt, for he was yet in Egypt, where he had fled from the presence of King Solomon. Then they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, Your father made our yoke hard. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. He said to them, Depart for 3 days, and then return to me. So the people departed. King Rehoboam consulted with the elders who had served his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, How do you counsel me to answer this people? They spoke to him, saying, If you will be a servant to this people today, and will serve them and grant their petition, and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. But he forsook the counsel of the elders which they had given him, and consulted with the young men who grew up with him and served him. So he said to them, What counsel do you give, that we may answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, Lighten the yoke which your father put on us? The young men who grew up with him spoke to him, saying, Thus you shall say to this people who spoke to you, saying, Your father made our yoke heavy, now you make it lighter for us. You shall speak to them, My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Whereas my father loaded you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. That sounds pretty brutal. All right, now, we'll stop there for a second before we actually read the part where Rehoboam decides what he wants to do. Here we are, they're at Shechem. Shechem is the place of covenant renewal. It's a place where Israel had actually first attempted to have a king in Judges chapter 9. And all Israel comes to make him king. Well, not all Israel is going to stay with him. The name Rehoboam, interestingly, the name means he has enlarged the people. Rehoboam's first act as king is to do precisely the opposite of that and make all the people run away and not want to be friends with him anymore. So doesn't live up to his name. Jeroboam, and don't confuse Jeroboam with Rehoboam. Jeroboam, as we note, he comes up out of Egypt, kind of leads his own exodus. He's like Moses. He's trying to liberate the people. And the narrator might be leading us on a little bit and make you think there might be something good about this guy. Just as we begin to think that Jeroboam will bring some kind of deliverance to this nation. The people request, lighten the service, and we will serve. Even though chapter 9:22 says Solomon had not made slaves of the Israelites, well, he had still apparently made their yoke hard. And Rehoboam has to deal with that. So Rehoboam gives them a 3-day waiting period, and they get the elders. They get the advice of everybody around them. The elders' advice says, Be a servant, serve them, and they will serve you. Which is brilliant reciprocal advice. A king should be a servant to others. And, concessions will conquer complaints. It's an example of the equal retribution in the Bible. A positive example of that eye for eye principle. Later personified in Jesus even. Jesus came to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. And, of course, the response to that, we are supposed to be servants as well. For those who wish to be first among us ought to be servants, and slaves of all even. But Rehoboam doesn't listen to the elders. The narrator actually spoils the ending of the story. In verse 8, he forsook the counsel of the elders which they gave him. Instead, he consults with his peers, because peer pressure is always such a great thing. And the young men's advice is more or less what? Huh? Obviously what he wanted to hear. You can't let these people push you around. Show them who's boss. That's what you've got to do. There's how should we answer? It's interesting in verse 9, Rehoboam says that. It's, what answer do you give that we may answer this people? He identifies himself with this particular group. And they say, well, we've got it backwards. We shouldn't lighten the load. We should escalate the labor policies. We should make it hard. If you thought you had it hard under my father Solomon, you haven't seen anything yet. Rehoboam's little one is thicker than his father's loins, which kind of crude euphemism in Hebrew, actually. Solomon's yoke was heavy. Rehoboam will add to it. Solomon used whips. Rehoboam will use scorpions. That's kind of a ridiculous image. It's possible that the scorpion was actually the like the Roman flagrum with several tails on the whip to beat people with. Or it's possible he's using actual scorpions to discipline them, which is pretty weird and brutal at the same time. That brings us to verses 12 through 15, where Rehoboam makes a decision. He makes his choice. Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the third day, as the king had directed, saying, "Return to me on the third day." The king answered the people harshly, for he forsook the advice of the elders which they had given them. And he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of events from the Lord, that he might establish his word, which the Lord spoke through Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. All right, now let's see if we can get the answer to this. What is the reason that the people reject Rehoboam as king? He made everything hard for them? Okay. What is the ultimate reason why they reject Rehoboam, though?
Ultimate reason, God.
Yeah.
They had already rejected God.
Is
Reality.
Is a rejection of Rehoboam a rejection of God? Is that what this is? Jen?
Sense.
God rejected.
It was because God had rejected Solomon. The reason that this event happens, it's not because Rehoboam wanted it to happen or didn't want it to happen. It's not because Jeroboam wanted it to happen or didn't want it to happen. It is because in verse 15 it says it was a turn of events from the Lord, that he might establish his word which the Lord spoke through Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. The reason that Rehoboam is rejected as king is because God said it was going to happen before Rehoboam ever became king. He told Solomon, "I'm going to tear the kingdom away from your son and give it to somebody else." He told Jeroboam, "I'm going to tear the kingdom away from Solomon's son, and I'm going to give it to you." Here in verse 15, we can chalk it up to, if we think, I've heard the way this story gets preached on sometimes, some people think that it's just a morality tale about how, you should only listen to older advice and not younger advice. That's not the point of the story. And in fact, if it is the point of the story, I got to ask, how do you handle chapter 13, where you got an old prophet giving advice that turns out to be deadly? The real person you ought to be listening to is the word of the Lord. The wisdom of your elders doesn't get you a comparative advantage compared to the wisdom of God, who has been around a little bit longer than everybody else. But what's going on here? Rehoboam takes bad advice. Why? Because ultimately God engineers this division. Is there any other story in the Old Testament where somebody takes bad advice and it turns out to really be God's engineering that puts that together? We've got to think back to last quarter, really, kind of.
Oh. All right. I just can't quite get there.
I'm curious what you were thinking, because I wasn't thinking of Saul. So maybe there's another story I hadn't thought of.
Well, I was thinking about going to the witch at Endor, but that really, got Samuel. Okay. Told him what God's word was.
All right. Let me paint the picture for you. All right. The king has to make a decision. He calls his advisors in. One advisor says do this, the other advisor says do that. Second advisor has terrible, terrible advice, and the king takes it anyway. Why? Because it was a turn of events from the Lord. Yes, when Hushai and Ahithophel go to Absalom, and Ahithophel tells him how he needs to get rid of David, and his advice would have worked. And Hushai gives him this grand plan that makes him look so much better and so much grandiose. Grandioser, is that a word? It's not. It's so much more grandiose. And Absalom takes that plan. We might think it's because Hushai is more persuasive. The real reason is because the Lord had decreed that he would destroy Absalom. There's a certain amount of comfort in that, actually. Because, it's because God willed it. The reason Rehoboam takes bad advice is because of Solomon's unfaithfulness, because of Ahijah's prophecy, and because of the will of God. There's a certain comfort in that. Guess what? The world is actually run by God and not by human stupidity. There's a certain... That's hard to believe sometimes, certainly. But who makes the real decisions? The Lord does. Man doesn't get to make those decisions. Really, the world is really run by the Lord. And He is sovereign over the nations. Nations rise and fall at His decree. So that's kind of a crucial thing I think we need to wrap our heads around. Now, let's keep reading. Verses 16 through 24. When all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, "What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel! Now look after your own house, David." So Israel departed to their tents. But as for the sons of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah, Rehoboam reigned over them. Then Rehoboam reigned over them. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was over the forced labor, and all Israel stoned him to death, and King Rehoboam made haste to mount his chariot to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. And it came about when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, that they sent and called him to the assembly, and made him king over all Israel. None but the tribe of Judah followed the house of David. And when Rehoboam had come to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen men who were warriors to fight against the house of Israel, to restore the kingdom to Rehoboam the son of Solomon. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, saying, "Speak to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, saying, Thus says the Lord, you must not go up and fight against your relatives, the sons of Israel. Return, every man to his house, for this thing has come from me." So they listened to the word of the Lord and returned and went their way according to the word of the Lord. All right, so here, Israel's revolt. The north secedes from the south. It's kind of the opposite of American history, but all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them. All Israel was the people who Solomon had rule over them and who had gathered to Rehoboam, and now here all Israel rebels. The song that they sing as they're rebelling in verse 16, we've seen that before. Anybody remember where? No. Yeah, it was in 2 Samuel chapter 20. And what was the context of that story? What was going on there? Has northern Israel ever seceded from southern Israel before?
Sheba, victory.
Sheba.
Blew the horns that have no part in David. Every man of Israel deserted David and followed Sheba, the son of victory.
Sheba, son of Bichri. Yeah.
Actually, that's right after Absalom's rebellion.
Yeah, it was right after Absalom's rebellion.
So Sheba thought he could kind of take the opportunity there while things were still in turmoil.
Right. Right. What's interesting is they quote this song here. The emphasis is not on the rebellion against Rehoboam or the rebellion against Solomon, but the rebellion against David. We no longer want part in the house of David. We've had enough of this. There was already high tension during the time of actual David. And now the rebellion against the house of David sort of finds a culminating point here. They departed to their tents. Here what we have here is this quote. Well, this quoted secession song. The issue is more about, we want to go to our own tribes and manage our own things. This Civil War actually was about states' rights versus federal sovereignty. Go figure. But what happens here, of course, it's really about slavery because the northerners are tired of being overworked by Solomon, but that's another issue for another day. They depart to their tents. We actually saw that phrase back in chapter 8 and verse 66. On the 8th day, Solomon had sent the people away and blessed the king, and they went to their tents joyful and glad of heart for all the goodness that the Lord had shown to David his servant and Israel his people. That was right after the temple dedication. Everybody went to their tents with joy. But here, what do we see here? Is they depart to their tents in rebellion. against the house of Solomon. They're done with it. Well, Rehoboam continues to reign over Judah in verse 17. Verse 18, Rehoboam sends Adoram, or Adoniram, and he was the forced labor chief. Now, this whole rebellion is about what? Why do they claim they're rebelling? Why do they claim they're rebelling?
Labor.
Forced labor, right. So what better guy to sort out the problem than the chief of forced labor, right? Well, his reception's a little rocky. It's waiting for somebody to get it. Rehoboam had apparently underestimated the people's capacity for revolt. They stoned him to death. Now he has to flee before they kill him. And so Rehoboam flees from Shechem back to Judah, and Israel's rebellion is perpetual, verse 19, against the house of David to this day. That as a side note, using the phrase "to this day" to show when the book was written kind of hits a little snag here, because northern Israel doesn't exist by the time 2 Kings is finished, because 2 Kings gets thrown into captivity. Now, 1 and 2 Kings were originally one book, and the end of 2 Kings is about them being in captivity and Jehoiachin eating at the table of Marduk. So at that point, northern Israel doesn't exist anymore. So to this day would kind of sound strange in that time. Side note, anyway. Verse 20.
Well, it may have been that the book was written over a number of years.
That is possible.
It could have been written shortly after, like Luke had. Luke probably wrote Acts as they were traveling, telling about Paul's travels, and then he may have sat down at the end of all of that and then edited his notes and things like that.
Well, yeah.
More likely he wrote it as he went along.
It's possible. Any composition theory for a book of the Bible is going to have, all kinds of assumptions in it. In verse 20, Jeroboam becomes king of all Israel, although Judah is not included in all Israel. And only Judah stays loyal to the house of Rehoboam. Except not only Judah, because Benjamin is also loyal to Rehoboam. There's kind of an interesting implicit lesson here about interpreting words like all and only over literally. Because the fact is that all Israel is not really all Israel, because Judah is not included in it. And only Judah isn't really only Judah, because we learn in the very next verse that Benjamin is also allied with Rehoboam as well. So there's kind of a lesson in biblical interpretation there. Don't read too much into the word all and only, unless you want to, overstep the boundaries of interpretation. Sometimes the Bible just speaks hyperbolically. Well, Rehoboam's response to rebellion after he gets back to Jerusalem, he decides to be like Abraham Lincoln and go back and conquer them with his own amassed army. But he gets stopped in his tracks by the prophet Shemaiah. I want to reunite Israel. You can't do that. Why can't you do that? Don't fight your relatives, the Israelites. Go back every man to his house. Kind of like every man to his tent. And why? Why isn't Rehoboam allowed to fight this war? He'd be fighting against his brethren. Yeah. He'd be fighting against God. Fighting against God is generally not a smart idea. It's like Gamaliel said, you don't want to be caught in a situation where you're found fighting against God. You won't be able to undo what he does. Now, does Rehoboam do anything right in this chapter?
Well, yeah, he actually turned back according to the word of the Lord.
Right, verse 24, he finally does something right. He listens to the word of the Lord and returns and goes, then they all return and they go their way according to the word of the Lord. Now, Rehoboam's reign is evaluated negatively when we get into chapter 14. But this is one thing Rehoboam does right. And Chronicles talks about a couple things that Rehoboam does right and a bunch of other things that he doesn't do right as well. So just kind of, I guess, remember that and keep that in mind. The rebellion has ultimately come from God. God's revelation here, by the way, is an act of grace. Because you think about it, Rehoboam could be completely flying blind, have no clue what's really going on. He gets into this mess by not taking older advice. He gets out of the mess by taking the advice from the oldest of all, the Ancient of Days, Yahweh. Not every crisis here is meant to be fixed. That's another lesson that's involved in this as well. Not every crisis that we get involved in is meant to be fixed. Sometimes there's wisdom in knowing when it's, time to quit fighting. You're not going to win this battle. Learn to pick your battles instead of continuing to fight and pick at the same battle over and over and wind up in the process, of course, completely self-destructing yourself. It's a lesson in that too, applied on the human level and applied on the divine level. So even though they listened to the word of the Lord, there's another caveat we have to throw in too, though. If we read further into Kings, do Rehoboam and Jeroboam enjoy peace between them and never fight any wars at all? No, they don't. They fight pretty much constantly throughout their respective ranks. In chapter 14 and verse 30 says that there was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam continually. And then in chapter 15 and verse 6, there was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all the days of his life. And that includes Abijam. Rehoboam's son fights a battle against Jeroboam in 2 Chronicles 13. And then, even after Jeroboam dies and his dynasty is destroyed and replaced with Baasha, Israel and Judah are still fighting. And they continue to fight, and they don't stop fighting until the reigns of Ahab and Jehoshaphat in chapter 22 and verse 44, where it says Jehoshaphat made peace with the king of Israel. So, even though they don't fight this particular time, well, they continue fighting their battles anyway, with no real gains being made on that front. Any comments or questions down through verse 24 of chapter 12? I skipped a question on the handout. How is God's faithfulness demonstrated in this chapter? How does God demonstrate His faithfulness?
Well, He made a promise to Solomon, caveat, and He kept His word, absolutely, even though it may not appear that, some people want to nitpick some of the things, some of the promises God made, but they all had conditions.
Yeah.
And when Solomon didn't follow the conditions, God kept His word. Rehoboam, on the other hand, also God said some things to him. He did exactly what He told him to do.
Yeah.
And in every case, sent prophets and so forth.
One of the key themes throughout the books of 1st and 2nd Kings is the fulfillment of the word of the Lord. And I may have mentioned this already, but I just want to remind you, keep your eyes open for how often in Kings, just an offhand comment is made about how this happened to fulfill the word of the Lord. And it's just the little things here and there, like at the beginning of 1 Kings chapter 2, for instance, when Abiathar is dismissed. The comments thrown in, this was to fulfill the word of the Lord that He spoke to Eli through Samuel to break his house. Or later on in chapter 16, somebody rebuilds Jericho and their children die. And the narrator says that was to fulfill the word of the Lord that was spoken through Joshua the son of Nun. So, there's just little things here and there. Chapter 13, by the way, is going to be all about the fact that God does things according to His word. When God says something's going to happen, it happens. And when somebody claims to speak for God and they don't really speak for God, woe be to that person. God's faithfulness to His word is a big deal in the book of Kings. And it's really a big deal in the whole Bible, but it is especially stressed and emphasized in the book of Kings. Let's talk about Jeroboam now. We'll kind of shift attention to the north for a minute. We're going to have this little ongoing game of ping pong for the rest of the quarter as we bounce between what's going on in northern Israel, the 10 tribes of the north, and southern Judah, which is really Judah and Benjamin. And there's going to be 2 sets of kings, and the chronologies are going to have difficulty meshing together. I put a chronological handout inside of the packet for this class to try to help you sort out the mess. There might be mistakes or difficulties with it, but it's designed to be at least helpful and show you where things are going. There are several charts. This chart is a list of the kings of Israel, and how some of them were good, well, pretty much all of them were bad actually, how long they reigned and how they died, because not all of them die of natural causes, some of them have help. The second chart is a chart of the kings of Judah, some of the kings of Judah were actually good. We have more information about the kings of Judah than we do about the kings of Israel because, well, we know what their mothers' names were, most of them. That's basically... but most of the kings of Judah are descendants of David, except for Athaliah, who doesn't count because she's a queen and an usurper and doesn't even get evaluative statements made about her. She's not considered a legitimate monarch. And the third chart we'll call the chronology of the kings. This is designed to be more of a to-scale timeline. It's not really to scale because that would be very difficult to fit on the page, but it's designed to kind of show you who overlaps with who and to put some dates on everybody. Now this timeline assumes some things. It assumes, for instance, that some of the kings actually were co-regents with their fathers or with their sons. And that's not always explicit in the biblical text. Sometimes you have to kind of put two and two together and piece together the numbers to work out these things. And there's a lot of people who are a lot smarter than I am who have figured that out more extensively. This was kind of my effort, which I think I heavily plagiarized some of this, but it's designed to be a help to you. And if you decide you disagree with any of the numbers on it at some point, well, you know, go ahead and modify it as you like. These numbers technically aren't in the Bible, at least not the year numbers, because they didn't have BC and AD back then. You'll notice that Jeroboam reigns a little bit longer than Rehoboam does, and actually even outlives his successor, Abijam. So we're going to see that as we get into the story. Now Jeroboam, the Lord has made a promise to Jeroboam, and that's what makes this next part so hard to deal with. Verses 25 through 33, Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. He went out from there and built Penuel. Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will return to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will return to their Lord, even to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So the king consulted and made 2 golden calves, and he said to them, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, O Israel, that brought you up from the land of Egypt. He set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. This thing became a sin, but the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. He made houses on high places and made priests from among all the people who were not of the sons of Levi. Jeroboam instituted a feast in the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, like the feast which is in Judah. He went up to the altar, thus he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves which he had made. And he stationed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made. And he went up to the altar which he had made in Bethel on the 15th day in the 8th month, even in the month which he had devised in his own heart. And he instituted a feast there for the sons of Israel, and went up to the altar to burn incense. And this is actually not a great chapter division, because the feast to offer incense gets interrupted by a prophet from Judah in chapter 13, as we'll see next week. Let's ask ourselves one very simple question. Why does, and we don't have time to fully extract everything from this text, so we will come back to it Sunday. Why does Jeroboam do what he does here? He is afraid. What is he afraid of? Okay.
And that they kill him.
And that they'd kill him. Now,
He was afraid that God wouldn't keep his word.
he is afraid that God wouldn't keep his word. And that is what is at the heart and soul of this entire problem right here. Is his fear is built on a lack of trust. Jeroboam is not motivated by faith here. He's motivated by fear. God made a promise to him. And rather than trust that promise, rather than trust it like Abraham and like David, Jeroboam doesn't trust. Where does the problem start? Starts with Jeroboam. Starts in his heart. Look at what it says in verse 26 and verse 30. Actually, no, look at that section of text we read. At the beginning and end has references to Jeroboam's heart. In verse 26 it says Jeroboam said in his heart that the kingdom will return to the house of David. And in verse 33, all of this was happened during a month that he devised in his own heart. Jeroboam's problem begins in the heart. It begins with the motives. It begins with the lack of faith. It begins with the fear that God will not keep his promise. What is he afraid of? He's afraid of Davidic loyalty. Every other rebellion against David's house ended with the insurrectionists being killed and the nation rejoining David.
Everything that you do in
Yeah.
that's all you do.
That's a good point to bring out. Look at how many things in this text are made by Jeroboam. And in Hebrew, it's actually even... Right. In Hebrew, it's actually even more forceful, because there's so many words that are translated, that it's the same word over and over that he made. Sometimes it's translated instituted, sometimes it's translated devised, but it's all the same. It's just Jeroboam made this, he made this, he made this, he made this, he made this. It's all the stuff he made. What about what God made? Something to think about. But yeah, Jeroboam, he's worried that the hearts of the people will return to Rehoboam and then he'll be killed. And so he in his heart turns away from the Lord. Kind of like another ruler who we recently saw turn away from the Lord in his heart. Solomon's problem with idolatry started in the heart. Jeroboam's problem with idolatry started in the heart. In our hearts, well, there's a reason the New Testament warns us in 1 John 5:21, keep yourselves from idols. It starts in the heart. Watch your heart, because it will become who you are. It will determine where you go. We'll talk some more about this next time, and Lord willing, get into chapter 13 as well. Thank you all for your comments and your participation, and we will get into 1 Kings 13 next time.